Hello guys, and welcome to the first episode of the second season of the Discord.NET bot development series. In this episode, we will talk about the command handler. What is its purpose? What can we do with it, and how do we make it? Let's get started. The first thing that we want to do is go back to Visual Studio. In here, we want to create a new folder, which will then contain our command handler. Right-click your project, which in my case is called Watermelon, press Add, and press New Folder. Now we're going to call this folder Services. Now why do we do this? We do this because the command handler will be part of our services. It's something that will be continuously running, and therefore it's a service. Let's press Enter, and then right-click the folder, press Add, and then we're going to create another class. Now we're going to call this class Command Handler. What you call it is really up to you. You can call it my own command handler.cs, but make it something that's recognizable not only for you, but also maybe someone that will work with you on your bot. Or if you ever decide to make it open source, that people understand what this class means. A very simple explanation can just be the command handler. This is the class that's responsible for handling incoming commands and executing them. When you've come up with a name or just called it command handler, you press Add, which will create a new class within the services folder. You will also now see that the namespace is not just watermelon, like the program.cs, but watermelon.services, because it's now in this services folder. Therefore, the namespace will also be watermelon.services or watermelon/services if you would have the path. The very first thing that we want to change is that we want to give this class a public access modifier. The next thing that we want to do is to inherit this class from initialize service. We do this by putting a colon here and saying initialize service. This means that this class will now inherit from initialize service. Hover over the red line, press the light bulb and say using Discord add-ons.hosting. Now you will still have an error. If you hover over command handler, press the light bulb, it will say implement abstract class. This is because the initialize service class, which we're now inheriting, has a task in it called initialize async, which we need to override in the command handler. Within this task, we can, for instance, bind events to methods so that when something happens, a method is being ran. But before doing that, let's add a few dependency injections. Let's go a few more lines up until line 11, press Enter, and here we're going to add some of the dependencies that we want to inject into this class, which we can then later on use. The first thing that we want is the iService provider. We create a new field, private read-only iService provider, and the provider, and then we create a new line. And then the next dependency that we want is the Discord socket client, which we can do by private read-only Discord socket client, and we just call this one client. Hover over the red underline, press the light bulb and say using discord.websocket. Again, we create a new line, and this time we want the command service. So private read-only command service service. Hover over the red line, press the light bulb and say using discord.commands. The final dependency that we want is our configuration. This can, for instance, be used to grab the prefix from our configuration file and then use it to check if a message contains that very prefix. For this, we say private read-only iConfiguration and then configuration. Again, hover over it, press the light bulb and say using Microsoft extensions.configuration. Now we have all these fields, but they're not yet injected. They don't have a value yet. And to do that, we can simply say ctor and then press tab. Make sure to press tab twice. ctor is one of the snippets that we can quickly use by typing a keyword such as ctor and then double tap tab, which will then give you a small snippet of, in this case, the constructor. In the constructor, we want to have all of these fields. So we want an iService provider, a Discord socket client, a command service, and an iConfiguration. We can simply copy the type and then the name. Or even simpler, both at the same time. Do this for each of the fields that we want to inject, just like this. Now that we've done that, it's time to actually inject these into the fields that we have over here. We do this by creating a new line in the constructor and saying this, referring to the fields within this class or methods that we have, dot, and then provider equals the provider that we got from this constructor. So just like this. And we repeat this for the client, command service, and iConfiguration. So this dot client equals the client, this dot service equals the service, and this dot configuration equals the configuration. Now we have all the fields that we need and we've injected them into our class. It's time to take a closer look to this override task that we have over here. The first thing that we want to do is we want to make this task an asynchronous task. Now we can get rid of this exception being thrown, and now we can start binding events to methods. What does this mean? In order to run a command, we want to wait for messages. And then when a message is sent, we want to check, does that message contain a prefix? And if so, is there a command behind that prefix? If that's the case, then we want to execute one of the commands that we have made. Let's start by binding the message received event to a method. We do this by saying this dot client. So we refer to the field over here, dot message received, referring to the message received event from Discord, which is fired whenever a message is received. And then we say plus equals to bind it to something. And then we say on message received. Now on message received is the name of a method that we can create. You can give this a different name. You can say on user message received, or you can call this anything that you like, as long as you know that this method will be ran when a message is received. I will call it on message received. Now hover over the red underline, press the light bulb and say generate method command handler dot on message received. This will nicely create a method for us, including all the arguments that we get from this very event, such as the socket message. Let's call this argument socket message to make it clear that we are referring to the socket message. In here, let's add some code. The first thing that we want to check is, can we actually cast this socket message to a socket user message? Meaning that the message was sent by a user and not a system notification or a message from Clyde, but an actual user, which may also be a bot. But at least then we can check that later. We can simply do this by saying if socket message is socket user message, and then we can do something. But there's the key lesson to learn here. We could make this very complex by creating endless amounts of if statement and then return and do a lot of things, but we can also make our lives a bit easier. We can do this by using early return statements. Let me show you what I mean. Let's get rid of these curly brackets, and instead of checking if this condition is true, we will check if this condition is false. So if we cannot actually cast this to a socket user message, we will do something. In our case, we won't really do anything except for return, meaning that if this socket message is not castable to a socket user message, then we just want to return. Now we will receive an error because you can't just simply return when a task is not asynchronous. Therefore, we're going to make this task async. And this is also because we will eventually start using a synchronous task within this method. Now we've done this, the next thing that we can check is if this source of this message that we now have is actually a user and not just a bot. To do this, we say if message dot source is not a message source dot and then user, we want to return. Now just like previously, you can get rid of this namespace over here, hover over message source, and just wait for the light bulb to appear and then press using Discord. Now we know that this socket message was castable to a socket user message, and we've also ensured that the source of the user is an actual user. Now we want to create a variable to let the bot check for a prefix in a certain position. We do this by saying var argpause equals 0. The next thing that we do is we say if our message does not have a string prefix, And then now we can refer to the configuration that we made earlier. So we'll say this.configuration, and then we refer to the prefix, just like this. And then we refer to the arc position. So we want to check for the prefix at the arc position that we just made here, which equals 0, which equals the very start of the message. So we'll say ref arcpos. So now it will check, does this message have a string prefix at the start of the message? Another thing you can add here to check is, does this message actually start with a mention of the bot? This might be convenient when someone, for instance, doesn't know the prefix of your bot. They can just mention it and that way find out what the prefix is. To do this, we say, and the message does not have a mention prefix of this dot client dot current user. And again, we refer to the arc position, so the first part of the message. As you've seen, we again used the very opposite. We're not checking, does this message have a prefix, but does it not have a mention prefix? And does it not start with a string prefix? And if those two are not the case, then we just say return. The next thing that we want to do is we want to create a new socket command context and then put that into a variable. We do this by saying var context equals new socket command context. Then we refer to the this.client, and then we refer to the message. And with this new context that we now have, we can execute a command. This is done by saying await this.service, referring to the command service that we made earlier, and then dot execute async, the context, which we just created, the arc position, referring to the position of where the prefix or mention may be, and then the service provider, referring to this dot provider, which then refers back to here. That's basically it. Now, whenever a message is received and it's castable to a socket user message, and a source is a message source.user, and it starts with either a prefix or mention, then the command will now be executed. Since this episode is more about the command handler than actual commands, we will really quickly create a simple command. But in the next episode, which will be episode 4, we will talk a bit more about commands on their own. So now, let's quickly create a test command to see if our command handler is actually working. But before we do that, we used a configuration value that we have not yet set, which is over here at line 40. Let's set this configuration value in our configuration file. We go to app settings.json, we create a new key, which will be prefix, colon, and now we can provide the prefix of the bot that we want to use. In my case, I will use W exclamation mark, just like this. Save your file, and now what we can do is we can create our very first command. We do this by again creating a new folder by right-clicking the project, clicking add, clicking new folder, and we can call this one modules, referring to modules of commands. We press add again, and we say class, and then we can create our very first module. You can see a module as a class containing all kinds of commands. And you can see them as groups. For instance, a module called configuration can contain commands related to configuring the bot. We will call this module just a general module. Create the class, and in here we can start making our very first module. The first thing we do is we make this class public. Next, we want to make this class inherit from module base socket command context. This allows us to use various methods related to commands, which allows us then to actually make commands. Let's create a very simple ping command. This can be done by creating a new attribute, which you can do by using square brackets. Then we say command, parentheses, and then you can give a name of the command by using a string. I will give it the name ping. The next thing that we do is we give a task to this attribute. We do this by just saying public async task, and then we will just call this ping async. And use curly brackets, hover over task, press the light bulb and say using system threading tasks. What we can do in here is we can simply say await reply async and then a message. We will say pong. Now reply async is not a method that we created, but we can access it because now this class inherits from the module base. Let's give it a shot. Run the bot and give it a few seconds to build and then also start running your Discord bot. Now as soon as you see this info gateway ready, you can start heading to Discord and you can run the ping command. You do this by saying W ping or whatever prefix you've given to the bot. Now it doesn't respond. Why is that? Let's take a step back, close our program and go back to Visual Studio. What did we do wrong? Remember that in episode 2, we at some point in the program.cs commented a line out of our code. Let's go back there. If we go down in the program.cs, we can see that we have commented out a very small part of our code, which are lines 53 and 54. We can uncomment this code out by either pressing this button over here or pressing Ctrl K, Ctrl U. Now, hover over command handler, press on the light bulb and say using watermelon.services or whatever namespace that your command handler is in. Now save the code by pressing Ctrl S, and now we are actually adding the command handler to our services as a hosted service. And this can be done because this command handler inherits from initialize service. The next thing that we also want to do now is we want to head back to our command handler over here. We want to go a bit more down. And here we want to say await this dot service dot add modules async. And then we can say assembly dot get entry assembly and then parentheses. And then we refer to the this.provider. This basically means that all the modules that we have are now added to the service collection and then they can be used. If you've made a typo like me by saying add module async or Visual Studio actually took over and filled it in for you, you simply go here and just type an extra S so it becomes add modules async. Let's give it a try again. Run the bot, again give it a few seconds to run, and as soon as it hits gateway ready, we go back to Discord and use our prefix again and use the ping command. If everything went well, you will see that the bot responds. And because we set case sensitivity to disabled, we can also just say ping by using caps or using a random casing that we like. Everything will respond. Now if we close the bot and go to Visual Studio, go to app-settings.json and change, for instance, our prefix over here to exclamation mark, then run the bot again. Give it a few seconds to run. Go back to Discord and now use exclamation mark ping. You will see that it also works because now we've updated the configuration and the bot picked that up. And that was basically it for this episode. We now have a working command handler capable of receiving messages and running commands. And we've also made our very first command, which is the ping command. In episode 4, we will talk a bit more about commands, how they work, what we can do with them, attributes that they have, and much more. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and I hope to see you in the next one. Have a nice day.